Thank you for watching this online class presentation from Cedarville University. Cedarville is one of just a few Christian colleges that holds daily chapel, with dynamic worship and powerful preaching. Students regularly rate chapel as one of their favorite Cedarville experiences. We invite you to learn more at cedarville.edu.
So, let's see how we did here. 116 out of 116. So who was the good guy in the stories of Samuel? Oh, wow. 90 to 10. Wow. I didn't put a right answer. I just want to see what you had to say. Okay. More on that later. Next question. Who is the bad guy? And is this going to be 90 to 10 as well? 89 to 11. Someone changed their mind. Somebody wasn't so sure. Okay, that's really quite interesting, quite revealing. So we'll talk about this again more as we move through. Let's go on to the last one here then. How many main characters are in Samuel? Now, I didn't ask you who they were. I just asked how many main characters. This ought to be interesting. Interesting. Okay, for those of you who said 1, who did you choose as the main character? Come on, talk to me. It's okay. God? Oh, that's safe. Okay. Number 2, for people who chose 2, who did you choose? Come on, don't be so shy. Talk to me. Saul and David. Okay, if you chose 3, who did you choose? I assume Saul and David and Samuel. And if you chose 4, and God. It's just so safe to throw God in that. Good for you. Okay. All right. Did anybody else have a 4th character that didn't sound so spiritual, that wasn't God, but that was somebody else? Yeah. Jonathan? Okay. All right. He's a pretty important character. David loves Jonathan. Anybody else? Any other extraneous character out there? All right. Okay, that's good. So let's get back then to this, and let me explain to you where I want to go with the story of Samuel. Now, I will often talk out of it as just one book because that's the way it originally was. It's only those of us with attention deficit disorders who can't handle the entire book at once, so we divide it up into 2 in English, right? But in Hebrew, it is just one book, Samuel. So if I just refer to it that way, often I'm speaking about the book and not the prophet. But it is typically in English classifications put in the historical section as though they are simply histories of David. And I want to talk about that a little bit. In fact, I want to take just a little bit before we actually get into the stories of David and Saul and Samuel and this entire book. I want to talk just a little bit and back up for a second and talk about narrative, how we understand stories, which is part of the reason why I gave you the quiz. I wanted to know who you thought was the hero, who was the bum, and how you interpret the stories, right? In order to answer those questions, you have to make interpretive decisions, and obviously you have made them. And so most of us don't hesitate to do that. We read a story and we say, well, here's what the story means, right? But I wonder if we actually really do know how to read stories. As the name of the course is Old Testament literature, we have taken some time out to take a look at given genres as we move through them. Most of the Old Testament, though, is narrative, and we've never stopped to look at that. It's not because we haven't neglected it. It's just that I wanted to go through a number of narratives, and we've done that so far already, so you could kind of see it in action, right? So I want you to have some examples of how we understand stories before we actually talk about the method of how we do that, so you have something to work with. So right now, for a couple of minutes, I want to talk about how we interpret narratives well, and then we're going to get back and apply those things to Samuel. All right? So let's start with this, and let's ask ourselves, why in the world do we even use narrative? And the answers, at least, are these, right? Number 1, it draws the reader into the story, allowing us to see and feel the truth. Now that probably sounds a little heretical to many of us, because when we think about truth as something which is objective, right? Which is stated, which is always there, and you don't feel the truth. That's far too mushy and feeling oriented, right? But part of the point of the story is to help take that abstract truth and make you feel it in your gut. And as you're reading through the stories and you're thinking about them, you're comparing, well, what kind of decision would I make, right? And you're there with David, and you say, would I be as courageous as David, or would I be as courageous as Saul or Jonathan, or would I not, or would I have made the same mistake that David made, or not, right? So it's intended to help us see and feel the truth. Number two, and this is really important, not only in what it affirms, but in what it doesn't affirm, and that's this: that narrative and stories are meant primarily to illustrate, not teach, propositional truths. Did you catch that? The stories are not so much teaching instruments as they are illustrative instruments. That is, what I'm saying is, the propositional statements, do not murder and do not commit adultery, are where God teaches us exactly what he wants. The story of David and Bathsheba and Uriah is where he pictures how this hurts and why this is wrong and how it happens, right? It kind of illustrates those propositional truths. So what I'm trying to say here is this: if the purpose of stories is to illustrate, then how should we actually interpret or find their meaning? Because typically we don't ask that question. We just go straight to the meaning. Oh, I know what the story means. Well, hang with me here for a second, and I'm going to show you a couple of stories or illustrations, right? I have two cartoons here, and I want you to tell me which one is better. Here's the first. I don't know if you've ever had a day like this where, you had the really good intentions, but man, it just didn't work out the way you kind of expected it to, right? Tell me you've all had those days. It's not a bad cartoon, is it? Huh? It's kind of funny, right? What about this one? This is one of my favorites. This is just hilarious. I love, you guys don't like this? Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot the caption. The fuel light's on, Frank. We're all going to die. We're all going to die. Wait, oh, my mistake. That's the intercom light. You just have to love the pictures of the people's eyes as they see this. Now, what is my method here? Well, if you take a look at this one versus this one, what's the difference? Well, the first picture, the first cartoon, explains everything right there with just the picture. You don't need anybody to explain that to you. You get what's going on, right? But with this one, if you don't have that caption, you don't have a clue what's going on. If you just sit there looking at a blank, you think, I have no idea. What does this mean, right? Unless they give you the caption, you don't understand this picture. Now, the reason why this is significant is because this is what Old Testament and New Testament pictures and narratives are like. Believe it or not. Unless there is a caption there, unless the writer is explaining it to you, you might well be coming up with some interpretation of the story that is completely different than what was intended. So let me put it like this. I'll use the phrase, the caption up there for the propositional truth and the picture here for the story. Or we'll just say the proposition and the story here. Every story that we look at in Samuel and elsewhere is going to be illuminated, right, by a caption, by a proposition. Now, let me give you some illustrations here, right? We've had some really important captions to stories that we've looked at so far. Probably the most important one was Genesis 3:15. Now, can you tell me what was one of the very first stories that all of a sudden, when you read the story in light of the caption, you came up with a whole different meaning for what was going on? Think back. This is part of the reason why I waited till now in the semester to do it, so you'd have some material to work with. What were some stories in Genesis that come after chapter 3 that all of a sudden make more sense in light of it than they did without it? You don't have to explain the story, just tell me what it is. Yeah. Yeah, the call of Abraham makes sense because now God is starting to fulfill Genesis 3. That's a good answer, but even before Genesis 12. Yeah, Cain and Abel, right? And we just throw Cain and Abel up there, right? Before we had Genesis 3:15 and you read Cain and Abel, you thought the moral of the story was, boys and girls, don't hit your brother, right? Or the first murder or something like that. In light of Genesis 3, all of a sudden the story of Cain and Abel comes along and you realize, oh wow, we've got an orange seed and a blue seed and they're having conflict. And what God promised in Genesis 3:15 is happening in the very first story. So you begin to get the idea, wow, these stories are connected to this proposition, and God is really serious about Genesis 3:15. And in fact, if we use that as something which kind of ties together all the other stories after it, all of a sudden we get coherence where we just found confusion before, right? Now, let's keep going here. Let's talk about Genesis chapter 12 as another really major, important caption which explains a whole lot of stuff coming after it. So, for example, what is the very first story you can think of that all of a sudden takes on more meaning in light of Genesis 12? And again, you don't have to go for real deep and profound. Just give me the first one. Remember how the stories go there in Genesis 12? What's the very first story? It is exactly the time that Abraham goes to Egypt, right? Sarah in Egypt, right? And until you read that story in light of Genesis chapter 12, you just think, oh, well, it's a story about you shouldn't lie, right? It's a bad thing to lie, because if you lie, you're going to get filthy rich, right? We've been through all that before. And you realize when you read Genesis 12, verses 10 to 20, the story of Sarah in Egypt, in light of Genesis 12, all of a sudden you realize, wow, God is serious about those promises. They are really unconditional. God will intervene in the lives of these Egyptians in order to make sure that this woman and this man have a seed, who have a seed, who have a seed, who have a seed. God is unconditionally committed to those promises, right? So that is what the story is intended to tell. It's not about lying, right? It's not a good idea to lie, but that's not what the story is about. And only when you take a look at the picture in light of the caption do you understand that, right? So as you keep moving down through the stories, we find more and more and more, like the sacrifice of Isaac. Again, it just amazes me how the sacrifice of Isaac makes it into a lot of popular culture. And it's actually one of those stories where people say, wow, what a monster God is. Because if you read that story out of context, it really does look like an evil story. But if you look at it in light of Genesis 12, you realize this is a question of Abraham. Do you believe I will give you the promises through your son? And Abraham says yes, and God says, well, I will, and that's a good thing. It's not about killing Isaac, right? It is about the faith of Abraham and his promises and testing that whole thing. So all the way through, the stories of Exodus, right? God making a great nation fulfills Genesis 12:2. The story of Balaam, God protects his people even when they turn away from him, and blesses those who bless them and curses those who curse them. And Joshua, God is fulfilling the land. All of these stories make sense when you tie them in. Is there anything else that maybe we have left out in the story or in the Bible stories from Genesis 12? Is there some other major area which it covers? The answer is, well, there's that one small one in Genesis 12:3, Jesus, right? In whom all the nations of the earth will be blessed, right? So as you read the story of Jesus, this is why Paul says, in Jesus, all of God's promises are yes. Right? God is saying yes to all those promises in Genesis 12:1, 2, and 3. In Jesus, he's the proof of all that, right? So just a little insight into how we've been doing it and the way we approach stories. We're always saying, what does the author want us to get here? And we just pay attention to the context and what his big propositional statements or captions are. All right? Now, let's go back then and talk about this idea of caption in these words. What does narrative illustrate? Are we left to our own to find out? I hope you're understanding that's not a good answer so far. No, you're not left to your own to find out. Does each story have a moral of its own? Questionable. Is 1 and 2 Samuel just a collection of miscellaneous good stories? And the answer is no, not, right? Or if we're good Hebrews, we say what? Make my day. We say what? Lo, right? Yeah, no, not at all, right? All biblical narratives are well written and very selective literary pieces which point to a singular theme. That is, there aren't just all sorts of colorful extra details for the sake of the story. Everything fits the big idea because every author is trying to teach a particular big idea, a singular theme. So that propositional truth or caption is always stated within the book and usually early in the book. And I hope that makes some common sense to all of us. Why would you put the caption early in the book? Well, so that when you move through the stories, they start to make sense. Out of 50 chapters of Genesis, where's the biggest caption occur? Genesis chapter 3, pretty early in the book, right? And you'll find it that way throughout. Old Testament and New Testament, so those propositional statements, those captions come early, and if you're paying attention and you're looking for them and you're trying to understand things in light of them, you're going to be a whole lot better off understanding what those stories really mean. So, let's get back then to Samuel and say, what is the proposition and thus the point or caption of Samuel? Well, in order to find that out, you got to ask yourself, where do we find statements of truth early in the book? So, open up your Bibles with me to Samuel, to 1 Samuel, and we will begin where the story does. Now, when we talked about the major characters, some people said David, some people said David and Saul, but actually the book doesn't begin with either David or Saul. Who does it begin with? Slightly trick question here, be careful before you answer. Yeah, it's not even Samuel, right? Even before Saul, before David comes Saul, before Saul comes Samuel, before Samuel comes Samuel's mom, Hannah. It was also interesting when I asked you how many main characters there were when we did say 4. The best choice was Jonathan or someone else. No one ever mentioned Hannah, but she's where the book starts. It's fascinating. So let's take a look at 1 Samuel chapter 1. There was a certain man from Ramathaim, a Ziphite from the hill country of Ephraim, and his name was Elkanah, and he has 2 wives. Don't ask me to explain this. One was called Hannah and the other Peninnah. And I don't know exactly what you call them. Maybe you call them co-wives or something, sister wives, I don't know, maybe. But as it turns out, they're not really very sisterly because, verse 6 says, and because the Lord had closed her womb, her rival, this is what Peninnah is called, her rival, kept provoking her in order to irritate her. Right? So the language is pretty clear here. It's na 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 na. You know, it's not very sweet or kind. It is irritating and provoking, and it's incredibly hurtful. I have kids and you don't. You know, it's just really childish the way she's treated here, but she is obviously deeply hurt and doesn't have children, and her, again, the text uses the word rival, does, and just rubs her nose in it all the time. And so she goes to the temple and she's crying out to God and she's praying to God, and Eli, who is there, looks at her and to add insult to injury says, what are you, drunk? Right, because she's mouthing the word. She says, no, I'm just pouring my heart out to God and asking him for a son, right? And so eventually little Samuel is born and she dedicates him to God, which seems like kind of a sad story because she takes him there when he was 12 years old or so. And you think, oh, God gives her son and then takes her away. Well, she also has more sons and more daughters after this, right? But she does have Samuel and she loves him, and so she takes him to the temple, and then chapter 2 happens, right? In chapter 2, you'll notice the formatting in your Bible is really, really different, right? It is, in fact, poetry, and what we have here is a prayer of Hannah that's put in poetic format. Now, I hope you learned from when we were working through Judges and elsewhere that when God puts things in poetry, it's like, wow, this is really important. This is where I'm going to really explain things, right? So let me just say, you can probably guess by now where this is going, that Hannah's prayer here is kind of a key that introduces the book, right? The words of Hannah provide the theme which the rest of the book merely illustrates. So the kind of things she says are things like this. Well, let me just say it like this, first of all. Hannah's speech is actually the caption of the stories of David. So if you want to go through and understand what's going on with David and Saul, right, you have to first understand what God is saying through Hannah. And Hannah's statements here, because Samuel has put them here at the head of the book in poetic form, are intended to be the filter through which we see what's happening in the book. Is the book about heroes? Is the book about failure? What is the book about? And Hannah clues us in, right? Her prayer is this. She says, look, from my experience here with barrenness and then God answering prayer, what I want to say is it is the Lord who sends poverty and wealth. And what she means, of course, is it doesn't matter what your advantages are. whether or not in this particular case, whether my rival is really, really fertile or not. What really matters is what God determines to do. The Lord sends poverty and the Lord sends wealth. He humbles and he exalts. I'm trying to kind of color code things here to help you make sense of it. He raises the poor from the dust and he puts down the proud from their exalted position. It is not by strength that one prevails. Those who oppose the Lord will be shattered. And so what she's basically saying is, when you take a look around you at all the different strengths and advantages and abilities and GPAs and all the different options and wealth and backgrounds and advantages people have, none of it amounts to anything unless you consider God. Right? And if God wants to, God can easily trump all those things. He can give those things, he can take them away, and he does so based upon whether or not one's attitude towards God is one of pride or one of humility. And if you come to God in a humble way, God blesses that and he gives grace to the humble, but he opposes the proud. Now, if you start with that, and I think that we should, then all of a sudden the rest of the book starts to make a whole lot more sense. So let me say, this truth gives unity to the whole book. Now, in your notes, I believe I have some really hard to understand outlines. Yeah, let me look at the first. Where's the first outline? Yeah, if you take a look at the notes, 1a, it says the divine provision of a prophet in time of apostasy. It looks like somebody from in seminary wrote that, right? I think it's a whole lot better to look at it like this: God prospers faithful Hannah. And if you look at 2a, it says the ark narrative, evidence of Israel's unfaithfulness. Well, yeah, that's true, but this is a better way to say it. God opposes unfaithful Israel. Right? And so as you take a look at the blue and the red here, I'm trying to understand the outline in terms of what Hannah says. If this is Hannah's point, if this is Samuel's point through the mouth of Hannah, then what is he saying? Well, God opposes unfaithful Israel. It's a story of the ark and when they lose it because they think it's a good luck charm, etc., etc. But then you find God prospers faithful Saul. Now, that's something that most of us don't think about much. I know that because 90 to 10, 89 to 11, most of us think that Saul is the bad guy of the book, right? And yet, you look at 3a here, God prospers faithful Saul, and then in 4a, God opposes Saul, right? And he prospers David. Now, most of us say, yeah, that's it. That's the point of the book. God doesn't like the bad guy. He does like the good guy. And then we keep reading here, and we find God prospers faithful David under 5a, and we say, see, there it is. That's the essence. David's the hero. We like him. Good stories. Kill those giants. Good stuff. And then we neglect, or we're surprised when we read 6a, God opposes unfaithful David. And yet, if we're going to be true to what Hannah says here, we're going to have to read all these stories and understand them according to the statement she's trying to make, according to the teaching which God is trying to give. So let me borrow a little bit from the Bible Project guys, because they say this really well. They've got those three characters of Samuel, Saul, and David in those first three boxes here, right? 1 Samuel chapters 8 to 31. And what happens here in the first part of 1 Samuel is this, that Saul is on the rise. Then in the middle of it, he turns away from God and he disobeys God because he has a whole bunch of character flaws, and the rest of his life ends in a terrible tragedy. At the same time this is happening, David is on the rise because he's faithful to God, and we look at that and say, yes, see, that's our guy, that's the story of the book. But then we fail to realize at the end, David himself has this dark side and consequences which happen to him. Now, here's our problem. We tend to look at this, right? We tend to look at the middle section here where Saul is on the downside, David is on the up, and we fail to look at these parts. That God prospers Saul when Saul is faithful, and God opposes David when he is proud. In fact, the story of David here, let me just zoom in on it a little bit and take a look at the ark up and the ark down. And just in 2 Samuel here, in chapters 2 and 3, he isn't in charge of the entire nation yet, but God strengthens him as people start to come and follow and join the crew and get on the bandwagon. In chapters 3 to 5, he unites the nation, right? The northern 10 tribes and the southern 2 come together and they follow him. And then the thing he does is he determines the place of worship. Now, this is really interesting because at this point, the Philistines had the Ark of the Covenant, and it was in the village of Jaarim, and so he takes it from there, he moves it to Jerusalem, and is this an important choice? And the answer is, according to Deuteronomy, it's an incredibly important choice. Because God says, when you get into the land and you take control of it, you take that Ark of the Covenant, you take the tabernacle, and you put it in a central spot where everyone can come to it so that worship is then available to everyone. And David does that, and it's just an incredibly smart choice on his part as king. Everything he does here, if you read the story, is really positive and good, and everybody loves him. And then God even establishes his throne in 2 Samuel chapter 7. Now, we're going to look at this because this is going to be a really important promise like Genesis 3, Genesis 12, Genesis 49, 2 Samuel chapter 7. You're going to have to memorize it, sleep on it at night, and know it every day for the rest of your life. 2 Samuel 7, really, really important promise where God says, you know what, you are going to have, and we've looked at it a little bit before under Amos, you're going to have a son who will build a temple and will reign on a throne forever. The Davidic Promise or Davidic Covenant. We'll look at it in a second. Just to say, at this point, things are going wonderful for David. David, God says, you're not going to be like Saul. Your sons will reign on the throne. And then David, like most of us, tends to think, wow, life is going so good, I owe myself. And in chapters 10 to 12, he covers his sin. I'm talking, of course, about Uriah and Bathsheba and that whole sordid affair. I don't need to cover it again with you, but he covers it up for an entire year until God takes the initiative through Nathan to come to him and say, Your Majesty, there was a guy who had one sheep, right? And that one sheep got stolen by a guy who had 1,000 of them, and he sacrificed it, and David gets angry, and Nathan has to say, I'm sorry I had to kind of sneak this truth in, but you were the man, you did this, right? So what happens to David after that is Nathan says, it's okay, you will not die. But the consequences are so bad, David almost wishes he had. Because the consequences are these. As he spoke to Nathan, the guy who did that ought to pay back fourfold. Nathan says, you've taken one life. Because of your actions, God will take 4 of your sons' lives. And so one of his sons, Amnon, who rapes his half-sister Tamar, dies at the hands of Absalom. Then Absalom rebels against his father for 6 chapters here and chases David out of Jerusalem. And David flees for his life in the wilderness just like he had under Saul. Right? But this time he's a guilty man. And then there is more rebellion, and eventually 4 of his sons die. So David himself demonstrates here the truth of the book. And that is not that God just likes good people, or that people are singularly good, but that in our attitude of when I get proud before God, God puts me down. And when I am humble before him, God raises me up. So if God does this with David and does not give David a pass, why would we think he would for us? So that's the holistic story of the stories of David and Saul. And obviously, all of us read them differently. All of us tend to think David is the hero and Saul is the anti-hero, but that isn't really the case as you read the whole thing through. So let me talk to you then about this 2 Samuel 7 covenant. Now, we've done it before. We've introduced it before. But in a moment, I want to go a little further and teach you some more about it and really nail it down here. And here is the background that we saw in Amos chapter 9, if you remember. In 2 Samuel, God blesses David so he can unite the country and establish his capital at Jerusalem. After David builds his palace and moves the tabernacle to Jerusalem, he begins to contemplate what he can do to further honor God. Right? And what he really wants to do is to build God a temple. A I'm living in this nice permanent house, and God is living in a mobile home. I'd like to build you a permanent house, a temple, God, right? So all of this is not news to you, just trying to refresh your memory. And the answer to it, of course, is this. God, again, loves puns, and God says through Samuel, the Lord tells you that he will make you a house, but when God says house here, he doesn't mean palace or place to live, he means a dynasty, right? As opposed to what Saul didn't have, sons who will follow him on the throne. I will set up your seed after you who will come from your body. Now we're getting into levels we didn't get into before, so this is new information. I want you to see the importance of each one of these points. Number one, you're going to have a dynasty. Number two, your seed who comes from your body genetically is going to be king. So the promise concerns one of David's physical descendants. You can probably see where this is going and why it's so important, I hope. He will build a house for me. Now when God says house, he's not talking about dynasty, he's talking about temple, right? So one of your sons is going to build a temple for me. This son will build a temple, and I will establish his throne forever. This son will never lose the throne. Now, this promise, 2 Samuel 7, just like the ones we've seen before, Genesis 3, Genesis 12, 49, is an unconditional promise from God that David will be the ancestor of someone who will come, be king over Israel, and in fact build a temple and reign forever. So, who is it? We all know who the son is, right? Right? We all know who the son is? Let's all shout it out together. The son is Solomon, right? Exactly, because he's a physical descendant, right? Who then builds the temple and reigns on the throne, right? Amen? We all there? You got it? Objection? Yeah, he doesn't reign forever. Oh man, he does not reign forever. So on a scale of 1 to 3 here, with physical building temple and reigning on a throne, what shall we give him? What kind of score should we give him? If we're Olympic judges, what do we hold up? I'm going to give him a 2.5, don't you think? I mean, he reigns on the throne, just doesn't do it forever. So I'll give him a 2.5, 2.5. So you say, okay, now I see where this is going. It's not Solomon, so let's all say it together. The son we're really talking about is Zerubbabel, right? Right? That's where you were going. I'm sure you were, because you know we love him, not just because he has such a beautiful name, but because he's a physical descendant of David. Number 2, he builds a temple. So all of that silly walkthrough stuff actually ends up being a little more theologically significant than you thought it would, right? He comes back and builds the temple out of all the rubble, and so then the next big thing after the exile is over, people are expecting, wow, this is it, the kingdom has come, and Zerubbabel's going to sit on the throne. But what? No, he doesn't sit on the throne, right? He never reigned on the throne, and his son didn't, and his son didn't, and his son didn't until Joseph was just a carpenter. So, if we're going to rate Zerubbabel on an Olympic scale of 3, we're going to have to give him a what? Yeah, just a 2.0. Sounds so bad, doesn't it? He's barely made the grade, right? 2.0. Say, oh, okay, all right, now I know who it is. It's not Solomon. It's not Zerubbabel. It must be, are you, of course, yeah, Jesus, yeah. Yes, of course, has to be, right? He's a physical descendant, right? He gets his legal right to reign through his father, his stepfather, Joseph, but he gets his actual physical right to reign through Mary, who is a descendant of David and Solomon. Does he build a temple? Now, this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because some people think, is he going to build a church? Is he going to build a temple? Well, I'm not going to solve it today, but let me just say in the book of Ezekiel, it talks about him building a temple at some point, and I think that someday he will, but we'll talk about that later. And finally, he will reign on a throne forever and ever and ever. So from this promise, then, he is the ultimate final fulfillment. We'll give him a 3.0. I need to find a 4th category in there so we can give him 4.0. It just sounds better than 3.0, but at least he completely fulfills, right? So let me take these promises then and add 2 Samuel 7 to it. So I trust you have figured out by now through the 17 hints that I have dropped that that's going to be a test question and you're going to know it, all right? 2 Samuel 7. 2 Samuel 7, another installment on the Messianic block. And we could also illustrate it other ways, like this. We haven't seen this chart for a while, but the last time we saw it was in Genesis 49, and now we can add David's name to it and keep tracing the line all the way, all the way, all the way down. And now you understand a little bit of why, when Matthew wants to tell his people that Jesus is fulfillment, the very first thing he starts with is 17 verses of genealogy. Why wouldn't you, right? Knowing how the Old Testament works, why wouldn't you do that? Another way we could do it is this. When we talked about the seed and the one who fulfills it, we saw Noah was kind of a figure. Isaac was kind of a figure. Joseph was a really good one because he was photoshopped in such a way as to make him perfectly picture the one. But now we can even add more, like Solomon, who is a son of David, but not the ultimate one, and Zerubbabel, who is comes in second place at least. But ultimately here, David, I think, is our best picture of what the king will ultimately be like. And so I want to call him David exclamation point, because this is why so often, so frequently, Jesus is called, and Jesus calls himself the Son of David. Right? And this is why Matthew in Matthew chapter 1 says, let me introduce you to the genealogy of Jesus the Christ, the son of David and the son of Abraham. Now, right there in that little verse, he summarizes half of the Old Testament. Because now you understand, okay, son of David, 2 Samuel 7. Son of Abraham, Genesis 12, right? The Messiah. All of those things rolled into one that speaks volumes if you understand where we're going. Now, with that then, let me share with you one more portion, and that is the last section of the book. I'm talking about 2 Samuel chapter 21. And here's the way, after we're finished with the kind of the failures of David and the trouble and the rebellion, the book finishes with chapter 21, the failure of Saul, a story, kind of a flashback, how he harms the Gibeonites. Won't go into the story, but let me show you how the very end of the book, chapter 24, is a similar story of a failure of David. And when David fails here, he causes a plague and harms Israelites. So again, if you're tempted to think David's a good guy, Saul's a bad guy, here's the way Samuel wants to finish the whole thing up. He says, let me give you two stories about these guys. Man, Saul was a king that hurt people. And you know what? David was a king who hurt people. And then, in chapter 21, he talks a story about David and his mighty men. But in that story, David has a serious weakness, and he is not the ultimate hero, the superhero of the story. And it's paralleled in chapter 23, another story about David and his mighty men. And once again, it's a story about weak David. You see where this is going? And in the middle of all of this section is David's poem about his hope for a future king. So what is this book saying? The way Samuel crafts it, what does it do? Well, number one, it gives us a really good illustration of Hannah's very simple but very important truth that God opposes the proud and he exalts the humble. And it also tells us that we've had a couple of kings here that God has started off. Saul was really not the best choice for king because he wasn't even from the line of Judah. David, the first king from the line of Judah, was a good choice and did some good things, and God will bring someone else through him. But ultimately, David did not crush the head of the snake. Ultimately, David's heart was squeezed tight by the snake, and David needs a savior, and we need a better David, we need a better king. And ultimately, when you finish this book, you don't walk away saying, wow, what a hero David was. Saul was such a loser. Good thing we got David. You look at it and think, man, at his best, he was a good picture, but David was not always at his best. And man, do we need a better David. And all the rest of the kings say the same thing. And that's why you just keep moving and moving and moving through the storyline, hoping, man, I just wish we could get a better king than David. I wonder if one's going to come, at least from an Old Testament perspective.